Hi, I'm Jeff Bramblett, your host of My Story. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to welcome our guest, the State Senator of Georgia, Chuck Payne. Thank you so much for being here, Chuck. But before we get to Chuck's story, I want to thank our sponsors, North Georgia Business Machines. If you have any needs in your business for a copier, fax, printer, whatever, please contact North Georgia Business Machines. They help make this podcast possible. And you find information on the description down below on the link there. And also, this podcast is produced by 41 Photo. And if you have any media services between Atlanta, Georgia, and Chattanooga, Tennessee, let 41 Photo know. You can find their information at the job description down below. They're also one of our sponsors of this podcast, My Story. Well, once again, thank you so much, Chuck, for being here for My Story. I'm honored to have you today. I was telling you earlier that I haven't known you personally, but I have voted for you. And I've had, my grandfather was really big into politics, police officer for 30-something years in this Dalton. And a lot of people knew him, House Bramblett, and he always told us who to vote for because he knew a lot of politicians and stuff. And a lot of politicians would come to his house when I was growing up and thank him for helping them get elected. But when he passed away, I'm like, who's going to tell us who to vote for now? But my mother's kind of picked up that role. She does a lot of research and a good Christian lady. And also I trust her opinion. And she's told me a lot about you. And some church members that have told me a lot about you. Logan Huggins said a lot of good things about you. So I've heard a lot of good things about you. We became Facebook friends recently. So I've got to see a lot of good things that you put on Facebook. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your story. I'd like for us to just start off and just talk about your early life and your upbringing and whatever you want to talk about on that. Basically your life before Jesus Christ, and then we'll lead into you get to become a Christian, you know. So thank you, Chuck, and just go ahead and share what's on your heart today.
It's good to be here, and I just to be here with you today is just, is a blessing to me. I just want you to know that up front, and just to kind of share what God has done in my life. And it's just been an amazing journey. But when you trust God, learn to trust God, and that's the key, is to trust Him even through the storms.
Right.
That's the text of that book that literally tells us, it's one thing. Trust and hope are two key things that we have to have in our faith.
Right.
Because without trust and hope, we have nothing to compel us.
That's right.
And so I've learned throughout my life, and just to trust and hope in things, and not to want for things, but to trust and hope.
That's right.
But as a child growing up, I grew up in Riverdale, Georgia, just south of Atlanta, when Riverdale was country. And my father was, my mom and dad were very committed in their faith, but we weren't regular churchgoers growing up as a kid. But my grandfather died when my dad was 8 years old, and it's always the amazing part of it was looking back on that. It was how my father, losing his father at 8 years old, my grandmother became a nightclub singer in Atlanta and became an alcoholic, and all that came with that. And just my father would tell me, just the stories of how that just magnified his missing his father.
Right.
And so by the time he came along and became a father himself, he just poured into us what no one was ever there what his father was not there to pour into him.
Right.
And it was just always, so my father was always learning all this stuff about civics and government, and it was in the JCs in the 60s and 70s. And back then was a paramount organization in Georgia, developing young leaders of young men. And he was learning all this stuff about civics and government, and he was coming home and preaching this stuff to his 13 and 14-year-old son. And just, and everything was just such revelation to him. And he always prefaced everything he told me with, son, every citizen should know this.
Right.
Every American needs to know this.
Right.
And so just that kind of laid the framework for where I think what led me to, after high school, to going into the Army and just living on. I've had 3 jobs in my life, real jobs other than fast food restaurants in high school, but I've had the Army and 30 years as a state juvenile probation officer, and now 5 years in the state senate, and every one of those has just been a perpetual growth in my faith. I accepted Christ when I was 17 years old at New Hope Baptist Church in Fayetteville, Georgia, and I never doubted the fact that I was saved, and just was on fire for Jesus, and throughout that point in my life, and graduated high school, and just, you become the uncertainty of that age and how you struggle through those for years. But the struggle is what led me to signing up and to go in the military, and this was the best decision I ever made, because I'd not joined the military, I would have never met my wife, who's from Benson, North Carolina.
Oh.
I met her just trying to get away from the Fayetteville and the military town. We found this little town that farmers and their kids would come every Friday and Saturday night, just cruise through this little small town about the size of Chatsworth. And we would started going over to Benson, and that's where I met. 6 months later, I met my wife. And then 3 months after that, I proposed to her.
Wow.
And with a condition that she would wait for me before I was getting out of the Army, because I couldn't be married to her and the Army at the same time.
How many years were you in the Army?
4 years.
4 years.
From 84 to 88. And so we met in 86 and married in 88. And just as I was getting out of the Army. And came back to Georgia in 88. And as they say, the rest is history. But that's the sense of family that I had for growing up. Family was everything in our family.
Right.
And my father was such a profound leader in our faith, and leading us, to overcome the trials of life that he had to learn the hard way, that we never really had to learn the hard way. But then going into the military, all those lessons, I think, came back to benefit me, because when you start maturing and becoming to your 20s, and you all of a sudden, all these things start making sense.
Right.
That really never made sense to you before. And so I've just continuously, I tell people all the time, as a state juvenile probation officer, I would tell my kids that it's literally, the transition of life as a child is literally when you're transitioning between two worlds. And I said, there's a reason none of us want to go back and be 13.
Right.
Because it's not an easy transition. At some point, we all reach back, and we take our eye off need to, which was supposed to be in front of us, and we reach back for want to, and we get our hand slapped. And I said, but the transition is between the world of want. Every child, since the beginning of time, every judge, every governor, every president, every child 12 and under, every thought that goes through a child's mind is directed by what they want. I said, but as an adult, we have to think about what is needed. And I said, that's the transition of that world, that 7 or 8 years. I would explain to kids, your transition between the world of want to the world of need to. On a bigger scale, it's the world of want to the world of hope. Because your hope will always compel you.
Right.
Your want will just sit on the fence and want. Your want is what leaves you bitter and angry because you didn't get what you wanted.
Right.
Your hope never leaves you in that state. Your hope, you wake up the next morning, your hope's still there. It's just it's as new as it was the day before.
Right.
And I said, and I explained, so I taught kids in that lesson, and so I literally got to be a father figure to thousands of young men and young women over my 30 years, and it was a path of my faith. It was my ministry, and that was my calling in life, and I never questioned it was my calling in life. But at the same time, in 1990, our first child was born, and I looked around the world at 25 years old and realized that the world had changed immensely since 1964 when I was born. I was 25, and I just thought, my God, look how much the world's changed. Where are we going to be 25 years from now? And I was looking at my daughter and thinking, where are we going to be 25 years from now when she walks through the door and says, I'm going to be a grandfather? What's the world going to look like then? So that's why I got involved in politics, and it was... And if you get a chance, you can go look up on YouTube. It's the only video I've ever uploaded to YouTube from the Senate. But just to tell that testimony of how great God is, because all those years as a probation officer, 9 days after I retired from being a probation officer, then Senator Charlie Bethel, now Supreme Court Justice Charlie Bethel, was appointed to the State Court of Appeals, and my phone started blowing up, and I decided to run for the Senate. But then, but my family literally was the center of all of that. And same as my father, we were the center of my father's world, and him pouring himself into us. it's just amazing to me to see what God had done, because on that night in 1990, my daughter was 6 months old, and I came walking in from the Youth Detention Center, and I was the primary man on the boys' side. I was the big, strong guy right out of the military that could keep them in line, I guess, and I had come in at about 1 o'clock in the morning. I worked 4 to midnight. I came in about 1 o'clock in the morning, and I heard my 6-month-old daughter in there stirring. She wasn't crying. She was just babbling.
Oh.
And I went to look in on her, and as I looked over the edge of the crib, she turned and looked up at me, and for the first time in my life, she gave me that, of her life, gave me that perfect, peaceful presence, the smile of my presence, the peace of my presence, as if to say, my daddy's here.
Yeah.
And I thought, my God, she already knows who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And that night, I tell people for years, I said, people ask you what got you into politics. And I said, well, my daughter smiled at me in the middle of the night.
Oh.
And that smile, I stayed up all night that night. And I wrote a poem for my wife.
Oh.
I was so moved in the moment. And the title of the poem is God's Smile. Oh. And the second half of that poem, I'd already mentioned in the poem that we didn't find out if Heather was a boy or a girl. We were just trusting God and all things to come.
You must like surprises.
And so, but the poem picks up after I had referenced that, and the poem picks up, said, but it would be a boy, so we believed. But God doesn't show what's up his sleeve.
That's right.
A nurse came in. It's time to have this child. They told you to push, and you really went wild. You pushed and you pushed until the head popped out. It was so big, no wonder you shout. Just a few more pushes. We were almost there. This baby sure doesn't have much hair. It's a girl, they shouted, as I grinned ear to ear. God was smiling through me at what he'd put here.
Amen.
They handed her to you. You should have seen your face. God was smiling through you too. I know that smile any place. Now sometimes we argue and jest whose features she has and who she likes the best. She has your nose and she has my eyes. She has God's smile, and that's no surprise.
Amen.
I wrote that when I was 25 years old. And that was the smile of the night that really got me into politics, because all of a sudden I realized the future mattered.
Oh.
Had no ambition in politics, but just the hope to have a voice. And but then after 27 years being involved in politics in North Georgia, just helping good men and women get elected, I was a grunt in the Army, and I was a grunt in the world of politics.
Yes.
And I just ran all over North Georgia helping good men and women get elected to office, and men and women of principle and value, biblical principle and value.
Mm-hmm.
And then I retired, and then 9 days after I retired, this fell out of the sky. And just fast forward, so then that day came on March 20th of 2019 that my daughter gave birth to our first grandchild. Oh. And his name is Jonah. And he's Papa's he's Papa's prize. And yeah. But the very next day, I'd already been to the Capitol. We're in session in Atlanta, and I had been to the Capitol on the 21st of March. And I came home and I got a text message from Governor Kemp saying, yes, Senator, I wanted to ask you tomorrow if you would go to the well and speak to the heartbeat bill. I just looked at my wife and said, I couldn't have planned this.
Right.
And I knew then why I was compelled to write that poem when I was 25 years old. Mm-hmm. And you can look it up. It's the only video I've ever uploaded to YouTube. It's Heartbeat, A Measure of Life by Payne. Oh. The only reason I uploaded that one was because I want, for my children and my grandchildren to always see, that 2 days after that day finally came to fruition, that I had looked for starting when I was 25 years old for that day to come. When that day came, to think 2 days later I'm standing in the well of the state Senate. The fact that I'm even in the Senate still blows my mind. But the fact that I'm standing in the well of the Senate, speaking not to the most pro-life bill of my daughter's lifetime, but the most pro-life piece of legislation of my lifetime. And it's, to me, it's just, that's what I mean by you chase your hope, but never your want.
Right.
And what I learned in the military was literally, to be content. So I tell people all the time, what Paul wrote from a prison cell, that he would learn to be content in whatsoever state he's in, there would be content in Philippians. I said that should compel all of us to be content.
Right.
And I said, and what the error is, I looked back over all the years and all the things that I've been through, and God brings me, actually this year in January, I was reading that of Paul, and it hit me that, that what Paul was admitting there was he had found himself in the perfect will of God. He had matured in his faith to no longer be under just the permissive will of God as a child in the faith, but had matured to the perfect will of God. And it's literally to be content in whatsoever state you're in, there would to be content. And so, but literally, and I told people, as I told my probation kids for those years, about the dangers of their want and their justification of their want. And you tell a 16-year-old, for 30 years, you have asked a 16-year-old, why did you steal that? And his only response was because I wanted to, or I wanted it. Right. And then the words to come back out of my mouth were, son, your want doesn't justify anything.
That's right.
And those words started preaching back to me when I was standing in front of a mirror. You realize my want doesn't justify anything either. And it's just that defining difference between our want and our hope. And as I tell people today, I said, they're two total different ends of the spectrum. A lot of our world today thinks my hope is my want is hope. They're interchangeable. But what I learned as a probation officer, what I learned in the military, and now what I've learned as a state senator is they're actually two total different ends of the spectrum.
Right.
Want is the shiny object that the devil brought into the Garden of Eden.
That's right.
And I said, and God said, Adam and Eve, all of this, all of my provision I've created for you, except for the one over there, the forbidden one. Leave that one alone.
Right.
The very second that God's provision was not enough, and they wanted for the one, God was already crying because his provision was not enough. And literally in every story of the Bible, I tell people all the time, I've become a preacher on this because literally I was just confronted at 30 years with kids justifying their want. And, I tell people all the time, I said, hope is what fills up offering plates. Want's what fills up our jails.
That's right. They're
two total different ends of the spectrum. And I said, but and even today, I said, there is no want in God. And I can prove that because had God ever wanted, he could have commanded, and we would have never had free will. We would have just been obedient creatures from natural birth to natural death. Right. But God hopes. He hopes so much that he gave us free will, hoping that we would choose him.
That's right.
Over this world, hoping that we would choose him. And I told people, I said, and what is the state we will be in? And I said, literally, purgatory is literally being trapped in the state of want forever. That's what hell is. It's to want forever. And heaven will rest in our hope. But yet they're two total different ends of the spectrum. And our world doesn't comprehend that anymore. And I believe the Lord brought me here to serve in the state senate because he was teaching me that throughout my life, from the time that I was a child, from a teenager, and my dad's civics lessons, and my accepting Christ at 17. The whole way I've just seen, it's become, I look back on it, and I told my wife when I first got elected 5 years ago, I said, my father was preaching all this stuff about civics and government. None of my friends were getting that at their supper tables. Right. And because that's when it hit me 5 years ago, was God's been planning this all along. And that's the humbling aspect of all this, is when you realize that the creators of the heavens and the earth has literally been interceding in your life to a point that you never saw until this fell out of the sky and you find yourself serving in the state senate. And I bring groups of kids because even though I retired from working with kids, young people are still my passion. Right. And I tell people all the time, there's a word my father gave me as a young man. And I tell people all the time, I said, just go Google the word posterity. The word posterity, I said, the height, and I said, when you Google it, it'll bring up the definition. I said, and it'll say, click here for more. And when you click on that to read more, it'll show you the history of the use of that word.
Right.
That word's use peaked at 1803. It was rising through the time of the birth of this nation, that everything that generation was doing was not for themselves. It was not to gain freedom for themselves, but it was all in the hope of their posterity, for those who would come after.
Right.
Those 56 men that signed that Declaration of Independence knew they were signing their own death warrant. And that's why John Hancock's famous, because he was really brash, egotistical, and they thought, well, I want the king to see my name first, and he signed his bigger than everybody else. But everything that those folks did were literally out of the sense of their posterity, which is hope. You're doing it out of the sense of hope, but not want. And I said, but sadly, that word's been in decline since 1803. It'll show you the graph of the use of that word. It's been constantly in decline. And then if you turn around and Google the word want, it was at its lowest at the 1800 mark. It had been in steady increase in our society ever since. And the two literally have crossed. And I just look at that and realize we've literally as a nation exchanged our hope for our want. And I think that's reflective in the $29 trillion in debt we are as a nation now. And that's that's the one thing that is bipartisan in Washington is the national debt.
Right. Yeah.
And if people want to be honest about it. But, to me, it's just I grew up literally with that sense of posterity. I think from my father's teaching. My father had that sense that he was going to make sure his kids were able to have what he never had as being fatherless and going through the rough times. Right. So he kind of had that sense of posterity when he was a teenager and a young man, and then became a father and just poured into us. And the same as I've tried to pour into my own daughter and my own son, and it's just, but that hopefulness of our posterity is literally what compels a nation to greatness, and that's literally what made us the greatest nation on the earth. Was not our achievement of our want, but the compelling hope that had us to overcome. And I tell people all the time, this is the greatest generation of the 20th century. Prime example was literally the generation that overcame the worst economic period of our nation's history in the Depression. And I truly believe it's as if God was preparing the people for what was to come in the war to end all wars, the Great War, a world war like the world had never known. Right. I said, because if had World War II come on the heels of the Roaring '20s, a very prosperous time, it would have never worked out the same. Right. But the people were prepared because the Depression forced the people of our nation to get their want behind them. You couldn't even think about what you wanted. You just hoped to get through every day and be able to provide for your family.
That's right.
And I said, and that sense of hope, chasing their hope but never their want, God trained them through a Depression, and that's literally what compelled them and got them through the World War. Was chasing their hope but never their want. Where the men went off to war, the women went to the fields and the factories for the first time, and enduring all that strife, not a single person of that generation ever uttered the words, "Yeah, but what's in this for me?" Nobody thought that way of that generation. Everything that generation did was out of the hope of their posterity. I said, and somewhere we went along and we lost that as a nation and as a people. Yep. And I said, for in order for be a great, it said, whosoever be last shall be first, and who shall be first shall be last. Well, understanding that that's also not only true for individuals, but it's also true for nations too. If we put God first, then our greatness will come. But if we put ourselves in front of God, then we're putting ourselves. We'll never be a great nation again. And that's literally, that is a cornerstone of our founding. As I preach to people all the time, this is an absolute historical fact. It's not Chuck's opinion. Had Christ ever been born, lived, died, and rose again, these United States of America would have never been, because it was literally the pursuit that came only of Jesus on that third day that literally compelled men of this earth to chase after liberty that they had never had before until Christ. Right. And that liberty, and that's what that pursuit is literally what led to the 500 to 600 year period called the Age of Enlightenment, with the great philosophical minds of their time, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and William Blackstone and all these others. And at the center of that 500 to 600 years was this question. The king is a sovereign authority. He's of God. That's why we call him Lord. But in Christ, we become heirs and joint heirs with Christ as the sons and daughters of God. How can the sons and daughters of God not have any rights, even to address a king that's acting in direct defiance of God's laws, of natural law? I said, and all that is the history that led to Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence, which literally didn't give birth to a nation. And I hate to break the news to everybody, but July 4th is not our nation's birthday. Our nation's birthday is actually June 21st of 1788. A day that nobody hardly even thinks about or recognizes, but that is the day that New Hampshire was the 9th state, achieving the required 2/3 of the states to ratify the U.S. Constitution, giving birth to a new nation of laws, not kings, where the law would be our king. The term rule of law was a brand new concept to the world that came out of the Age of Enlightenment. All the world had ever known before that was the rule of kings. And what came out of the Age of Enlightenment is, could people live under the rule of law without a king? And I said that this nation was literally founded on the fact that we would have no king, but the law would be our king. And when I became when I was joined the military, when I became a juvenile probation officer, when I became a state senator, all three of those things required me to put my hand on the Bible, and raise my right hand, and swear an allegiance, not to a higher power, not to a president, not to a governor, but to the Constitution, the law. The law is our king in this nation. We are a nation of laws. And I said, but in England, if I were elected to Parliament even to this day, I swear an allegiance to the crown.
Oh, really?
And that is literally that was the separation that the Declaration of Independence prescribed. Was we separated ourselves from the crown to assume sovereign rights of authority unto ourselves. For the first time in the history of the world, men and women of this earth had no higher power, Romans 13, had no higher power of the earth between themselves and their Creator. That's the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson listed all the ways the king had violated his sovereign authority, and that is tyranny. The true definition of tyranny is when they were trapped under a king who's acting in direct defiance of natural law or God's law, and yet the people had no recourse. You're trapped in that state of tyranny.
That's right.
Today tyranny is, don't utilities forgot to pick up my garbage. It's tyranny. No, that's not tyranny. Tyranny is literally when you're trapped under a king, and that state of tyranny is what compelled them in faith to make their case before God and the world in that Declaration of Independence, to separate themselves from the sovereign authority of a king, to do what? And this is paramount, to assume sovereign rights of authority unto themselves. This nation was literally born on the idea that, an understanding that literally sovereign authority comes from God to the people.
That's right.
We would have no king, but the law would be our king, was the cry of the day in the 1700s. And that was, and that's just one of those things. I look at the world, when I was a young man, and I just thought it was going to be forever, before there was when Jesus was telling the disciples about the last days, and he said, and because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. And as a little boy, I remember hearing that and thinking, oh, that would be dreadful. I couldn't imagine what the world's going to be, 500 years from now. Yeah. But the truth of the matter is, I'm seeing that in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And so I just, that's where I kind of, and I told my mother, and this is another thing, that when 9 days after I retired, my phone starts blowing up, because then Charlie Bethel got appointed State Court of Appeals. Within those first 2 weeks of me deciding I was going to run for Senate, I called my mother one day, and I told Mom, Mom, I don't know why, but your words to me when I was 16 and 17 when I would leave house, my mother would take me in by the hand and look me in the eye like she was looking into my soul. And she would say, son, you just remember who you are. You know, that became my conscience when I was that young man.
Yes.
To remember who I am. And I said, and I told her 2 weeks in the campaign, I said, I feel like those words have come back to me in such a profound way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and honestly, I think that's wise, because I think that's what the good Lord brought me to this position. I'll be here as long as the good Lord plans for me to be here.
That's right.
And the day He's through with me being a state senator, I'm going to dance back to the house, just looking up and saying, okay, you've led me through the Army, 30 years working with those kids, and they were my kids. I loved them as my own.
Yeah.
And to now, being a state senator, I'm just going to say, okay, what you got next?
Right.
Because, when you literally, and I tell people all the time, I said, this is the thing, the error we make so many times in our faith. I said, Jesus said, follow me. Time and time and time again, He said, follow me. To follow Jesus is to follow only our hope. Jesus is our hope, to be compelled only of our hope, but never our want. But only of our hope. And that's why Jesus told the rich man, He said, well, go sell off all that you have and give to the poor, and then come follow me.
Right.
And he went away sorrowful because he was of great wealth, and he couldn't give up his want in exchange for his hope. I said, and that's just something I've learned. That's in every biblical stories. In the Garden of Eden, I tell people, it's, God said, all of this I've created for you except for the forbidden one over there. Leave that one alone. The very second Adam and Eve wanted, before the act, the very second that they were compelled in their lust for greater than God's provision, God's provision, God was already crying, because His provision was not enough. As I preached to my probation kids for 30 years, the happiest man that you're probably going to see today is more likely to be the guy that's collecting your garbage.
Right.
Yet he whistles while he works, and he praises God when he gets home that God's provision is enough. He's just like Paul. He's content in whatsoever state he's in. And I think that that's literally what the Army and those 30 years working with those kids as a probation officer taught me, that I had to learn before I became a state senator, was that full understanding that God was teaching me through all that time. And it's a very humbling aspect when you realize that God's been directing your life since you through all you come into the faith as a child. When I was 17 and accepted Christ, I was a child in the faith. Right. And to say I didn't do a bunch of stupid stuff, and I have a lot of things I had to ask forgiveness for, is that would be a lie if I told you I didn't have to do that. Right. But I also look back and just realize that God's been interceding in this long before I ever knew. And that's the humbling aspect of it, when you just realize that the Creator of the heavens and the earth knows my name. And knows He not only knows my name, but He's also been directing the affairs of my life. And and so I just keep trusting God, and we'll continue to trust God, and just keep chasing my hope, but never my want. And wherever this goes, it'll be to God's glory and not mine. Because if you don't ever do it about what you want, then God gets all the glory. And that's just like the heartbeat bill that we did 2 years ago. 3 days after that, we went to speak at a What's Next rally in North Atlanta. It was a pro-life organization, and there were 500 people in the room. And I just told the gentleman who carried that bill, I said, you do realize you're the reason this bill got all the way to the governor's desk and signed into law? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, because you never made this bill about you. The whole world knows about the heartbeat bill, but have you ever heard the name Ed Sessler?
Don't think so.
That's the representative that was carrying that bill.
Oh.
And I watched him time and time again faithfully. He's a great man of faith. And he just faithfully kept presenting that bill time and time again. He bumped all the bombarding of questions, and he just faithfully just stayed to the task, but he never made this about him. I said, that way when it gets passed and it gets to the governor's desk, God gets all the glory.
That's right.
Because we didn't let our want say that, well, I want some of that glory from me. And in politics, that's a rare thing to see.
Yes.
And
yes.
to see Representative Sessler do that, Chairman Sessler do that, it just, so I had to brag on him at that meeting with 500 folks in the room and say, we all need to give him a round of applause because he literally never made this bill about him. And I think that's key. In our faith is literally just to trust God and to chase only our hope through life, but never be compelled of our want. Because our want is what leaves us, I preach to my probation kids, our want's what leaves us bitter and angry. Our want is literally, you don't get what you want, you're angry about it. Your hope never leaves you in that state.
That's right.
That is the difference in our hope and our want. And so I think to my colleagues in the Senate, I'm kind of becoming a preacher on that, in the sense in the Senate, and I'll even tell the governor himself, don't bring me what you want, tell me what you need.
Right.
I can work with you on that. But if it's about just winning an election or something like that, then don't bring that to me because I can't help you with that. And I think that's just giving respect. Since day one, I've just prayed for God every time I go to Atlanta. That's my consistent prayer since day one is, Father, just allow me to keep my want, leave it at home. So when I go into the Senate today, that I can just have a complete, clear mind and eye of discernment to read through all this legislation that's coming for me so that your will be done, not mine.
That's right.
And so that's kind of what I've done throughout my life, and God continues to bless me in just profound ways, and I just, God is good. God, and God is just absolutely good. And I'm literally in the Senate. I'll just add this. I know you probably got other questions, but just to add this is, I've always found honor in the fact that in the state Senate, I'm a retired juvenile probation officer. I retired making $35,000 a year in my 30th year because I was a rare bird that I was a caseworker for 30 years. I had no desire to be an administrator within the agency and fight for the agency. I was fighting for kids.
Right.
And so I retired making $35,000 a year. When I retired, I thought, well, fine, I'm going to finally get a job that pays some money. And then I wound up running for Senate and taking a job that pays $17,000 a year. So literally,
wow. Yeah.
So I'm not a financial wizard, obviously, but God's been good and provided. We live in the same house my kids grew up in. It was paid for now, and with the little bit that I draw in retirement as a juvenile probation officer, and what we would get paid as a senator, I'm right back to what I was getting paid as a juvenile probation officer.
Wow.
But God's provision is enough.
Amen.
His provision is always enough, and to be content and happy with God's provision, and just He always provides. Always provides, and He's always provided a way, and He's provided a way in the wilderness, and He provides a way for us today if we would just learn to trust Him and understand the difference between our want and our hope.
That's right. Yeah. Well, Chuck, I've enjoyed hearing about your story, and as I was listening to your story, hope you don't get offended, but I thought, he really is a man, a brave man, or he's crazy. But sometimes a thin line between brave and crazy, right?
Right.
I knew you were a politician. I knew you were a Christian. But as I learned about you, I learned you was in the military and you jumped out of airplanes. Okay, that means you're a little crazy or you're brave or a little bit of both, right? And then I realized you worked for juveniles and teenagers and probation. And I was a youth minister for 15 years. And many times people thought I was crazy for working with teenagers for all those years. But you doubled twice, you did it for 30 years. And I got a little bit too old in the flesh and to handle teenagers and youth ministry for too many years. And praise God, He called me into pastoring and got to working with adults and stuff. But I still have a passion for kids and love kids. And then I found out that you're a history buff, apparently. You know history. And I've discovered that you're a poet also, and you write poetry. So you're a very talented man, and you've done a lot of great things. But I think the most important thing is you give God the glory. You trust God. You're a man of faith, you're seeking God's will, you're willing to do God's will, and God's will is perfect, it's acceptable, and it's good. His will is good, perfect, and acceptable. And is there any other life-changing events or stories you'd like to share, or people who you like to thank or who have influenced you? And I know your father and other family members have. But
well, my wife, Angie, literally just, she's always been a blessing to me. Mm-hmm. And she is my rock. And I tell people, any man that ever says he's the better half, he's lying to you, because God had a plan.
That's right.
He created Adam and said, "Wait a minute, I can do better than that."
That's right. That's right.
And so
the new improved version, right?
But Angie is literally, she is the least materialistic person I've ever known. Uh-huh. And I think a lot of that, she had the same traits as my own mother did. My mother grew up of one of 9 kids, and was the next to the youngest of those 9. And they kept having kids so that they keep kids working in the field to help feed the family through the winter. And that was just the way. And very lean, but the thing that I always admired about my mother was, she was always the hardest person to buy for at her birthday or Christmas, mm-hmm. because she never looked at anything with want. Mm-hmm. She never looked at it because she grew up in that mentality. Well, I saw in my wife that same look. Mm-hmm. She grew up in North Carolina, and she actually worked in tobacco fields as a young child, mm-hmm. just to help provide for their family and kind of live that hard life. And so I think that groundedness is really what attracted me to my wife. That in 3 mm-hmm. months after I met her, I proposed to her, but she's just been such a tremendous blessing and a rock for our family. Yeah. My daughter and my son, to this day, they don't call daddy all the time, but my daughter and my son call mama every day. Yeah. As grown adults, they still mm-hmm. call mama, and mm-hmm. she's just always been that rock. And I don't. She's one of those I also think, well, I would not be here doing this if it weren't for her. Mm-hmm. And the fact that when you retire and you think, okay, after 30 years I've been doing this job that didn't pay no money, and then you tell her, okay, I'm gonna take this job to pay $17,000 a year. Yeah. The fact that she was content with that, mm-hmm. and I tell people it's amazing, because literally, when I 9 days after I retired, when this fell out of the sky and everybody's calling me, and my wife and I talked about it, and then on that Wednesday and then Friday I get a text message saying qualifying starts Tuesday, so I really mm-hmm. had no time to think about it, and I showed my wife the text message, and I just looked at her and said, "Are we doing this?" Mm-hmm. Now, mind you, my wife doesn't like politics. Mm-hmm. And she just looked back at me just as a matter of fact. She goes, "Yes, we're doing this." Hmm. And I was kind of shocked, because she was so matter of fact about it. And I said, "Are you sure?" Because at best, I'm like at 60 or 70% there. Mm-hmm. And she just looked at me with just complete confidence and just said, "Honey, I've always known this day was coming." Mm-hmm. And so I just think it's just, God blessed me in such a profound way with a wife. Mm-hmm. And that, we literally are one. And I tell people all the time, when I learned from my wife raising my kids that maybe become a better probation officer, I said, women have their distinct strengths and abilities. Amen. God gave women distinct strengths and abilities. Mm-hmm. And just as he gave men distinct strengths and abilities, but he also gave men distinct inabilities. Yeah. And weaknesses. And he also gave women distinct inabilities and weaknesses. I said, but if you ever think about it, God first established the family before he even established the church. Mm-hmm. I said, so all of that was our strengths for one purpose, mm-hmm. for raising families. Mm-hmm. I said, when it came to raising our children, my daughter and my son, I was just so blown away by just seeing the glory of God, and how just my strengths and my weaknesses, and my wife's strengths and her weaknesses, mm-hmm. literally were wrapped around our kids. Right. I said, that's where you become one in marriage. Mm-hmm. For raising children, is because literally God's plan was perfect. And I said, why can't we just, we got to argue about women's issues and men, strengths mm-hmm. and abilities. I said, why can't we just say we're equal, but our abilities are equal, but at the same time, an equal in necessity. and equal in every capacity, but they're kind of pointless without the other.
Mm-hmm. Equal but different.
And when I was coaching Little League baseball and softball with my kids, I coached Little League sports, and it was my outlet from working with probation kids. I got work with little kids. Coaching gave me an outlet to work with the kids that weren't in trouble all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but that was one of the things I realized let my daughter or my son get hurt out on the ball field, and I could drop down to one knee and, out there as one of the coaches and drop down to my knee and say, "Come here, baby, come here, come to daddy."
Mm-hmm.
And then they'd run another 150 feet to get to mama sitting in the bleachers. And that's when I realized I could be the most loving, compassionate father in the world, but I'll never compete with my wife and her ability to nurture her children.
That's right.
I said, I don't take that personal.
Yeah.
But at the same time, when my teenagers got to be teenagers, my kids became teenagers, I realized that my lines in the sand in my children's eyes were non-negotiable. Mm-hmm. And they knew that dads were non-negotiable. Moms were always for debate.
That's right.
In the eyes of the children, but it takes both of those.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the good Lord's plan. And if we would just, stop, if we get our hope in front of us and our want behind us, it becomes clear that literally God's plan was a perfect plan, and we should just be able to, be content with where we are and roll with what He's given us to roll with.
That's right. That's right. We were talking earlier also that wives are good at keeping us husbands humble.
Oh, yes.
Yes, the world and politics and other stuff, they may pump us up and try to make us have pride, but they're good at keeping us humble there. Well, Chuck, we need Christian politicians, and I want to thank you for your service in the military for our country. We need a strong military, and I just want to thank you for serving our country that way and serving our state as a senator. And I want to encourage our listeners to pray for Chuck and pray for our politicians, but thank you for serving us. But also I want to thank you for being a man of God and a servant of Christ, and your obedience to Christ and seeking God's will. And thank you so much for coming on. You're always welcome to come back on. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we end the podcast
Well,
today?
if I could just share one thing.
You go right ahead.
As a juvenile probation officer for all those years, as I kind of grew into the job, when I was 23 years old and right out of the military, I had brawn for the boys, but I ran from the girls because I thought I was cute, believe it or not. And so I ran from the girls. I said, but then as the kids became the age of my children, that's when it got precious to me, because they all became my kids, the boys and the girls.
Right.
And I would tell people, younger workers all the time, the probation officer just coming out of college to be a juvenile probation officer, I would say, you want to fall in love with your job? And they're like, certainly. I said, well, good. I said, you want to be good at your job? And they're like, of course. And I said, well, the best thing I tell you to do is go look in the mirror for about 10 minutes and come to terms with the fact that you were once a stupid 16-year-old who thought they knew it all, and wake up later in life that you realize you didn't. Mm-hmm. But I would tell them all the time, I said, throughout your career, God's going to crack a window every once in a while. Mm-hmm. And He's going to show you the fruit. Our job is just to plant the good seed in every kid in front of us. Mm-hmm. It's not our job to worry about what that seed becomes. Our job is just to plant the good seed. That's right. And trust God that it'll grow. And I said, and every once in a while, it's always going to come in a time throughout my career. It always came in a time when I needed it. Mm-hmm. God would show me the fruit. It might be somebody just walking up to me in Walmart, and remembering me from the years of the RYDC and saying, you probably don't remember me, but one night you took 10 minutes to have a long heart-to-heart talk with me, and I just wanted you to know I never forgot what you said, and it really impacted my life and helped me turn my life around. Mm-hmm. I said, let that be what drives you to come running back in the next day, because it's never going to be your paycheck. Mm-hmm. And so I literally, that seeing that fruit all those years, but then in 2019, my wife and I were getting everything ready around the house for Christmas. And this Christmas, our kids grew up in the same house. It's paid for now. We lived there forever. And we get everything ready around the house for Christmas. We're in my truck. We stop at a gas station on Walnut Avenue. And I'd already hauled off a load out my outbuilding that morning to the landfill and just getting everything cleaned up around the house for Christmas. And I pulled in the gas station on Wanted Avenue and pump gas. My wife goes in, gets the water. She comes back out. We both get in the truck at the same time, shut our doors at the same time. And just as the door shut, somebody hollers, "Chuck!" And I just looked at my wife, and she just gave me that I'm married to a politician look. And I said, "I'll try to make it quick." So I opened the door of my truck, and I left it standing open so whoever it was coming could see. I've got my wife with me. We were leaving. I didn't plan to stand here for 20 minutes and talk about what you saw on the news.
Right.
And as I look up, there's a young man running from Wanted Avenue into the gas station. And I can only assume that he was sitting in a car and looked over and saw me at the gas station and had said, "Let me out."
Oh.
Because he's running from the Wanted Avenue into the gas station, and he comes running up to me. He said, "I just knew that was you. I just knew that was you." And I said, "How are you doing, sir?" And he said, "Chuck," he said, "Do you remember me?" I said, "Son, I remember your face, but names don't stick with me anymore."
Right.
And he said, "Well, Chuck," he said, "I just want to say thank you." He said, "I was on probation with you when I was 15 and 16. And he said, "I just want to thank you for all that you did for me." And I said, "You're welcome, son." And he said, "No, Chuck." He said, "I continued to get in trouble. When I was 17 and 18, I was in and out of the jail as an adult. But Chuck, it was all that stuff you preached in your office that helped me turn my life around." And that's when I put my arm around him. I said, "Son, if you'll be proud of somebody, you be proud of the one looking back at you in the mirror. Because I'm the one, all I did was planted the seed. You're the one that nurtured that seed and made it grow." And I'm thinking that's our feel-good moment. And he looks back at me and he said, and he steps back away from me. He goes, "No, Chuck, you don't understand." I went, "What?" He says, "Chuck," he said, "I'm 29 now. I'm married and I got 2 little girls that call me daddy." He said, "Chuck, you literally saved my life." He started scrolling. I got all emotional. And afterwards, I got back in my truck and just looked at my wife and just said, "And you wonder why I love what I got to do for 30 years.
Right.
But then I told her, a couple weeks later, I started thinking, I said, "Why is God showing me the fruit? I don't do that job anymore. Why is he now showing me the fruit of a job that I did years before?" But then 2020 came. And to be in politics in 2020, when COVID hit in March, and literally for 5 weeks, I was on the phone for 12 hours a day with just fear.
Yeah.
And then I said, just throughout that year and all that 2020 brought, I said, it was that one moment at the gas station. And I just realized, came to realize in 2020, I said, okay, that was just God saying, it's fixing to get really rough. But just remember, I'm still out in front of you. So, but I came to realize in 2020, in my own faith, that it's not enough just to praise God on the mountaintop. It's not enough just to praise him as we're strolling across the valley. But what 2020 showed me was literally the blessing it is when you're praising God for 3 feet at a time during the struggle of the climb. If you're still praising God for 3 feet at a time during the tough times, the hard times, God blesses you in such a tremendous way. And I know that we all went through a lot in 2020.
Yeah.
And just to tell people, I said, the foundation of freedom were the laws of Christ, to love God with all our heart and our mind and our soul, and to love our neighbors ourselves. If we would just commit to do that, it'll be amazing to what we can accomplish as a people, as a community, and as a nation. But thank you for letting me be here today, and God bless you. And thank you for your podcast and for all that you're doing and bringing the good word to people.
Yes.
Because literally the inspiration of hope is what we've got to have for our future, and for that sense of posterity, for those who will come after us. These young men working behind the cameras today.
That's right.
They are our posterity, so let us to commit ourselves to do everything we can for the future they'll know.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you again, Chuck, and you're always welcome to come back. And I just want to ask our viewers before we go, if you know someone that needs to hear Chuck Payne's story, share it. Share it with everybody you can. To God be the glory. Perhaps someone can see Chuck's story and it can lead to their salvation, or them overcoming something, them receiving trust in God and hope. God did a life-changing event, many life-changing events in Chuck's life, and he can change your life. I want to encourage you, if you've never asked Jesus Christ to be your Lord and Savior, he's just a prayer away. All who call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. And I want to encourage you to do that today. If you got any questions or comments, you can contact us at the description down below the podcast. I want to encourage you to subscribe to the podcast and share it, like it, dislike it, make comments, whatever. We want to hear from you. If you want to come on and share your story, we'd love to have you. Once again, I want to thank our sponsors, North Georgia Business Machines and 41 Photography. Once again, thank you and God bless you and goodbye. Thank you so much, Chuck.
Well, thank you for
That was great.